Melissa Crane was supposed to check out at 11 a.m. The desk clerk at the Sleepy Pine Motel remembers looking at the door to room 16 around 11:45 and thinking maybe she'd overslept. It wasn't unusual. Guests often ran late, especially new mothers. But by noon, housekeeping had already moved past the room twice. No noise, no movement. Finally, at 12:10, a knock. No answer. A second knock, still nothing. When the cleaning staff opened the door with the master key, they found the room empty. Neat, undisturbed, but not checked out. The bed was made. The sheets folded down at the corners as if someone had started their morning and then decided not to finish it. The portable crib in the corner had collapsed and leaned gently against the dresser. No toys, no clothing, no baby formula in sight. Just silence. The manager on duty checked the logbook and saw the name. Melissa Crane, 24, one child, traveling alone. She'd checked in the night before at 7:48 p.m. Security footage from the lobby showed her signing in, baby on hip, small duffel slung over her shoulder. She looked tired. No one was with her. She paid with a debit card and asked if the room had a microwave for bottles. She smiled once, faintly, when the clerk made a joke about babies not caring what state you're in. That was the last confirmed time anyone saw her or her son. Outside, Melissa's 2006 Honda Civic was still in the parking lot, parked in the second row, just 5 spaces from the lobby, locked. No visible damage. The rear passenger window had a suction cup sunshade and an empty car seat base. Everything else looked untouched. When officers arrived just after 2 p.m., the scene struck them as immediately strange, not chaotic, not ransacked, but quiet in the wrong way. Her purse wasn't in the room. Neither was her diaper bag. But oddly, her wallet and keys were still in the drawer beneath the television. Her phone charger was plugged in by the bedside, cord neatly coiled. Officers checked the bathroom. The towels had been used and hung back up. The toothbrush was still damp. There was no blood, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. But there also wasn't any indication that Melissa had packed and left. She had just vacated. The manager was questioned. He'd seen her the night before, briefly, when she asked for extra towels. She hadn't mentioned anyone visiting her, hadn't complained about noise, hadn't asked for assistance. The guest in room 15 hadn't heard anything either, just a baby crying once around 10 p.m., then nothing. Security footage from the hallway cameras showed Melissa leaving her room around 10:15 p.m. with Liam in her arms. She turned toward the vending machines, stepped into a shadowed corridor, and then nothing. A delivery truck had pulled in and blocked the camera angle for 38 seconds. When it pulled out, she was gone. The camera never caught her returning. By that evening, local police had begun an official missing persons report. Flyers were printed, phone pings were requested, family members were contacted. Melissa's mother, who lived in Boise, hadn't heard from her daughter since 2 days prior. Melissa had told her she was driving to Oregon to visit an old friend. The route made sense. The motel was halfway, but there were no texts, no calls, no GPS trail after 10:27 p.m. when Melissa's phone stopped transmitting. That was the same time the vending machine footage stopped showing her. That was also the last time Liam's baby monitor app had recorded anything. In the hours that followed, it became clear how little anyone knew about what happened in those 38 seconds. There was no evidence of someone following her, no obvious threats in her past. No custody battles or restraining orders, just a young mother and her baby en route to a friend's home, stopping for the night, then vanishing without noise, witnesses, or warning. Her car remained parked for days until the police had it towed for forensic inspection. No fingerprints other than Melissa's, no signs of tampering, her clothes, her travel itinerary, her second bottle of baby formula, all still in the motel room. But the crib was folded up. That, for detectives, became the sticking point. If someone had taken her by force, why would they neatly fold the crib? And if Melissa had walked out voluntarily, why leave her wallet, her keys, her car? By the end of the week, the motel had returned to normal operations, but room 16 stayed vacant. Something about the stillness of that room, the eerie organization, and the absence of any event that could be clearly named left investigators grasping. It didn't look like a crime scene. It didn't look like a runaway. It looked like someone had planned something, but no one could say who. And as the hours ticked into days, the question deepened. If Melissa walked out holding Liam that night, where did they go, and why did nothing else walk out with them? The timeline started to form around a single timestamp, 10:15 p.m. That was when Melissa Crane was last seen alive. The motel's hallway surveillance captured her exiting room 16, cradling Liam against her chest, one arm wrapped around his blanket, the other holding a bottle. Her body language was calm, unhurried. She didn't look panicked or pursued. She paused briefly near the corner of the hallway, glanced down toward the vending machines, and stepped into the corridor that led to the side lobby. But right then, a delivery truck hauling crates of soda pulled in. It parked diagonally, blocking the exact camera that would have caught her next movement. 38 seconds passed. When the truck moved again, the hallway was empty. Melissa was never seen on any other camera after that. Detectives rewatched the footage dozens of times. Every second was slowed, enhanced, filtered, and dissected. The timing didn't make sense. The vending machines were just 20 feet from where the camera lost sight of her. Even if she'd changed her mind and turned around, she would have passed back into view. She didn't. There were no side exits, no stairwells, and no unlocked doors in that short stretch of hallway. Officers walked it themselves. Time after time, there was no blind spot large enough to disappear into. And yet, she had. The truck driver was found within 48 hours. He'd made a scheduled delivery to the motel's restaurant, then left. GPS confirmed his route. He hadn't interacted with Melissa and didn't remember seeing anyone in the hallway. His vehicle was searched. Nothing suspicious. No trace of Liam or Melissa. He was ruled out. Investigators then turned to nearby traffic cams and businesses, but a lightning storm that same night had knocked out 2 key cameras at the nearest intersection. Power surges disrupted recording between 10:12 and 11:03. The only other gas station within visual range had indoor cameras only, nothing covering the outer lot. Once again, timing had worked against them. Tips began to roll in. A clerk at a convenience store 2 towns west claimed she saw a woman with a baby around midnight, said she was wearing a red hoodie and looked nervous. But the footage, grainy and distorted by rain glare, showed only a woman with similar build, different facial structure, different baby carrier. False match. Then came a trucker's report from a highway rest stop, claimed to have heard a baby crying from inside one of the women's stalls, but when he alerted staff, they found nothing. Another dead end. Calls came in from as far as Nevada and southern Washington. A woman at a laundromat in Pendleton, a baby carrier dumped behind a diner in Boise. Every single one was followed up. Every single one led nowhere. At the center of it all stood the Motel, a bland, aging 2-story building with beige siding and flickering fluorescent signage. The owner, a man named Harold Dunn, had run the place for 15 years. He knew his regulars, his delivery people, his overnight workers. He was the one who reviewed the internal logs for the police. The register showed no unauthorized keycard use for room 16. No door opens were logged after Melissa's 10:15 p.m. exit. No emergency calls from neighboring rooms. When asked about staff activity, Harold provided full access to payroll and shift records. Everyone checked out. No one had seen or heard anything strange that night. But something about Harold's demeanor stuck with officers. Not suspicion, but discomfort. He didn't like talking about it. He kept repeating one thing. "I've never had anything like this happen here. People don't just vanish between vending machines." Days turned into a week. Investigators canvassed the property with dogs. Cadaver units were brought in. The motel's backlot was dug up. Storage sheds were unlocked and searched. A retention P, the first name that came up was Troy Kessler. Melissa had filed a temporary protection order against him in 2015, just months after Liam was born. There had been no arrests, no court hearings beyond the initial filing, and no charges ever stuck. But the police knew the pattern. On paper, Troy was just an ex-boyfriend with anger issues. Off paper, he had a reputation. Neighbors from Melissa's old apartment remembered yelling, slammed doors, one incident where a stroller was thrown down a stairwell. Friends said Melissa had cut off all contact after Liam turned 6 months. She'd moved, changed her number, left her job without much explanation. She told people she didn't feel safe. that Liam's future depended on silence. When detectives knocked on Troy's door, he didn't hesitate to open it. His reaction wasn't grief. It was disbelief. He said he hadn't spoken to Melissa since the fall, hadn't even known she was in Idaho. He looked thinner than his old photos, more drawn, maybe medicated. He claimed to be clean, working a warehouse job in Spokane. His alibi for the night Melissa vanished was thin but verifiable. His supervisor confirmed he'd been at work until 4 a.m., loading inventory with time-stamped scans on record. Security footage showed him leaving the building at 4:07, walking alone to his car. He lived an 8-hour drive from the motel. That was enough to clear him, for now. Still, police kept him in the loop. Sometimes they do that not because someone's guilty, but because they're the last known variable, the last unresolved tension in the missing person's life. But Troy wasn't much help. He didn't know where Melissa had been staying. He hadn't tried to contact Liam. He didn't ask many questions. He just said, "She was always afraid of something. I thought it was me, but maybe it wasn't." It was a strange thing to say, ambiguous enough to linger. Meanwhile, the tech team combed Melissa's phone records and online accounts. The last ping from her phone came at 10:27 p.m. near the motel's south wall, the same window of time when she disappeared from view. No texts, no data usage after that. Her Gmail account, normally accessed once or twice a day, went dormant. Her last Facebook login was 2 days before she checked into the motel. No Snapchats, no Uber orders, no GPS trails. It was a clean break, as if the digital side of her life had died at the same moment the physical trail did. Detectives pulled her carrier's tower data, hoping for a bounce from nearby cells. Nothing. The silence was too sudden. Phones don't just stop unless they're powered off, battery removed, or destroyed. They checked trash bins across the property, drainage pipes, and nearby dumpsters. The phone was never found. With Troy ruled out and no activity from Melissa's digital life, investigators broadened the net. They reviewed motel guest logs from the 3 nights surrounding her disappearance. 2 registered sex offenders had stayed at motels within 10 miles that week. Both were interviewed. One was a long-haul trucker with a route through I-84 and a history of soliciting minors, but his dashcam and GPS logs placed him 300 miles away during the window. The other had an airtight alibi. A third name popped up, a transient laborer with a sealed juvenile record. He'd been working night shifts in the next county, and though officers couldn't legally access his past file, nothing tied him to Melissa. The trucking angle gained momentum. The motel sat off a popular interstate route with minimal lighting and a direct rear lot exit. It wasn't uncommon for independent drivers to rest overnight there without checking in. Surveillance footage of the lot was limited, but grainy frames showed 3 unregistered trucks parked briefly in the hours surrounding Melissa's disappearance. By the time anyone reviewed it, they were long gone. No plates were readable, no drivers could be identified. Search warrants were filed for toll booth records, weigh station logs, anything that could match vehicle descriptions, but the volume was overwhelming. Without a clear suspect or evidence of a crime, prioritizing data became guesswork. And the theory that Melissa had walked away on her own didn't sit well with anyone, not with her folded crib, not with her wallet left behind, and certainly not with the kind of mother friends described, protective, routine-driven, always watching for signs of danger. Friends told investigators that Melissa had become hyper-vigilant in the months before she vanished. She avoided crowded places. She stopped sharing photos of Liam. She told one friend she thought someone was watching her, then brushed it off as new mom paranoia. She wasn't the type to trust easily. She wasn't the type to leave her child alone, and she wasn't the type to vanish without a fight. But without noise, witnesses, or digital footprints, the theory that took hold was one no one wanted to admit. Abduction. A fast, deliberate, silent removal. Someone who knew how to work around cameras, someone who knew exactly when to move. And the longer the silence stretched, the more it seemed like whoever took her knew how to make someone disappear. On to cross the highway was drained. There was no trace. Melissa's phone hadn't pinged since 10:27 p.m. Her bank account showed no new activity. Her son's pediatric records and insurance logins were untouched. It was like someone had hit pause on their lives and never pressed play again. The media began to pick up the story. National outlets ran brief coverage. Young Idaho mother and infant mysteriously vanish from motel. But without evidence, it faded. And still, investigators returned to that single missing frame, those 38 seconds. It didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt orchestrated. But no one knew who would have had the timing, the access, or the motive to pull something like that off without leaving a mark. When they reviewed older footage, nothing unusual appeared. No strangers loitering, no suspicious cars parked near exits. Just a silent hallway, a passing truck, and the unanswered question, how does a woman holding a baby vanish inside a corridor with no exits? By the third week, Melissa Crane's face was everywhere. Gas station bulletin boards, highway signs, folded into newspaper inserts across Idaho and Oregon. The official missing persons flyer showed her holding Liam, smiling softly in a sunflower field 6 months earlier. But the photo that got the most traction online was the motel security still. Grainy, time-stamped, just as she walked toward the vending machines with Liam asleep on her shoulder. That was the image that stuck. A mother mid-step, caught in the last recorded moment of her life as anyone knew it. The world responded the way it sometimes does, too fast, too scattered, too late. Local volunteers organized grid searches starting 3 miles from the motel perimeter. They walked fields, creek beds, roadside ditches. Church groups packed lunches and passed out orange vests. Retired hunters led efforts through wooded patches west of the interstate. Truck stop dumpsters were opened. Drainage pipes were scoped. A team of off-duty EMTs floated sections of the Snake River looking for anything. A carrier, a toy, a blanket, something to prove Liam had been near water. On day 12, just off County Route 88, a volunteer spotted a small white object tangled in brush beneath an overpass. It was a baby sock, worn, damp, size appropriate. Forensics rushed the item to the lab. Melissa's mother, Dana Crane, was called in to confirm if it looked familiar. She thought it might be, but she wasn't sure. She hadn't seen Liam in person for nearly 2 months. It had a small gray stripe. She remembered a pair like that in a gift bag, but couldn't say for certain. DNA results were inconclusive. The sock had partial material consistent with Liam's profile, but not exclusive to him. The area was known for heavy foot traffic. The lead was logged, bagged, shelved. Dinah became the center of the case. She wasn't supposed to be. She was a quiet woman, had spent most of her adult life teaching elementary school. But something shifted after Melissa vanished. Her voice got sharper. She cried less and spoke more. News stations began inviting her on morning segments. She held up Liam's onesie. She kept repeating one phrase. Someone knows something. You don't just lose 2 people. A GoFundMe started by Melissa's cousin raised $28,000 in 6 days. The money went toward private investigators, billboard placements, and digital trace consultants. The hired firm traced Melissa's debit card to 3 previous gas stops, matching receipts to the timeline. They also tracked cell tower data for known offenders in the area. No overlap. They flagged a name connected to a 2012 abduction in Utah, but the man had died in 2014. Another lead wasted. 4 weeks in, hope collided with confusion when a woman showed up at a small clinic in Pendleton, Oregon. She claimed to be Melissa Crane. She gave the right birthday. She said she'd escaped something underground. She looked malnourished and carried no ID. For hours, authorities scrambled. Dana was told, and a plane ticket was arranged. But by the time she arrived, the woman had recanted. Her name was Jessica Lawton, a known transient with a history of psychotic breaks. She'd seen Melissa's photo on a local board and believed they looked similar. She wanted a family again. Dana didn't speak publicly after that for nearly 2 weeks. Her silence became more haunting than her voice had been. The motel where Melissa vanished was empty of guests. No one wanted room 16. Eventually, the manager stopped offering it. Police tape had been gone for weeks, but people still walked around it. The vending machine corridor was gutted and replaced. A rumor started that Melissa's ghost had been seen in the parking lot. Teens posted videos faking sightings. One showed a baby crying looped under motel sounds. The detective on the case ordered it taken down. By the second month, search parties had dwindled. The GoFundMe plateaued. Melissa's name fell off trending lists. People moved on, not out of malice but out of exhaustion. Leads had become echoes. Volunteers went back to work. Online speculation turned toxic. Some accused Melissa of running. Others suggested Troy had faked his alibi. A few said the baby never existed, but the investigators hadn't stopped. Behind the scenes, they filed warrant after warrant. They tracked long-haul truck routes, re-interviewed motel employees, and analyzed gas station logs for out-of-state plates. But there was nothing new. The original file had grown thick. The incident timeline had been reduced to a redacted list of dead ends. And somewhere beneath it all, the truth still lived. Out of reach, one detail away, one turn they hadn't taken. But they didn't know which. The trail wasn't just cold. It had vanished the moment Melissa stepped into the shadow of that hallway and didn't come back. The motel had changed hands twice since Melissa Crane vanished. It had been rebranded. The exterior repainted in pale blue, and the sign out front now read, "The Redwood Inn," an attempt to scrub its reputation clean. Most of the old staff were gone, room numbers had been updated. A handful of locals still remembered what had happened back in 2016, but to passing travelers, it was just another roadside stop on Interstate 84 with cheap weekly rates and flickering hallway lights. The story of the missing woman and her baby had faded into urban myth, something people vaguely recalled but no longer tracked, until a closet no one remembered became the center of everything. It was early March 2024 when the motel's new janitor, Anthony Marks, was told to clear out what the manager referred to as the back utility room. The door had been stuck for years, sealed shut after a partial remodel in 2018 when the motel downsized and began storing extra furniture. The maintenance crew had logged it as non-essential, and over time, it simply became part of the structure, forgotten, unmarked. Anthony forced it open with a crowbar, and a thick dust cloud poured out. Inside were 4 stacked twin mattresses, a cracked vending machine door, and 3 folding chairs covered in plastic. But behind the pile, wedged into the corner under a rotting wooden cabinet, was something he hadn't expected. A square opening, roughly 2 feet wide, cut into the drywall. The edges were rough and unfinished, not standard construction. Anthony crouched down and pulled the cabinet aside. What he saw inside made him stop breathing for a few seconds. Tucked inside the shallow crawl space, nestled in a layer of undisturbed insulation, was a small plastic storage bag, sealed. Next to it, partially folded, was a faded child's shirt with cartoon whales printed across the fabric. The size was unmistakable. Toddler, no older than a year. Anthony backed out of the room and called his manager. By 4:15 p.m., local authorities had arrived and sealed off the area. Forensics teams moved fast. The crawl space hadn't been disturbed in years, and the temperature-controlled environment had preserved the contents remarkably well. Inside the sealed bag was a powdered formula container, unopened, expiration date, late 2016. A rubber pacifier, slightly discolored but intact. And buried beneath both items, a motel keycard. Handwritten on the back in faded black marker were the numbers, 16. Melissa's room. The story broke by evening. News vans returned to the property. For the first time in 8 years, Melissa Crane's name was back on the evening report. Dana Crane got the call from the lead detective just before it aired. She didn't speak. She just asked to see the shirt. Officers drove to her home that night. She sat at her kitchen table and confirmed it. It was Liam's. She'd bought the set at a clearance sale in Boise. There had been 2 matching shirts. The other had been found in the motel room closet, folded neatly next to Melissa's jeans. The crawlspace was photographed, measured, scanned for DNA. Tests confirmed the shirt contained Liam's genetic material. The pacifier, too. It was real. This wasn't a planted clue. It wasn't staged. It was them. They had been there. The question was, why? And how long? Detectives theorized that the space had once been a utility access point, perhaps linked to the air duct system or maintenance piping. It had likely been part of the motel's original layout before being drywalled during early remodels. But someone had reopened it. The square cut wasn't professional. It was jagged, tool-marked. The cabinet covering it hadn't been attached, just leaned in front like a disguise. The implication was chilling. Someone had intentionally created a place to hide something, or someone, just feet from occupied guest rooms. The discovery reignited everything. Officers re-examined renovation permits, staff logs, supply shipments from the years following Melissa's disappearance. They reopened interview transcripts with night managers and contractors. A name started surfacing, someone who'd worked odd hours, had access to storage keys, and disappeared from employment records not long after 2016. But no charges were filed. Not yet. In the meantime, the room that nobody rented, the sealed closet no one remembered, became the only place that had held a piece of the truth. For 8 years, while search teams scoured riverbeds and forests, while Dana lit candles and held up her daughter's photo in front of cameras, while detectives stared at static hallway footage, the real evidence had sat in a space smaller than a crib, inches from where it all began. And now investigators had a new question. If Liam's shirt and formula were here, tucked away with Melissa's motel key, did that mean she had returned to the room, or that someone else had taken them back without her? The crawlspace was never meant to be lived in. It had no airflow, no light, and just enough room for a person to crouch inside, knees pressed to chest. But someone had used it. For how long, no one knew. Forensics took over the scene within hours of the discovery. The space had been shielded from the elements, insulation lining the back wall, temperature stable, moisture-free. On the floor, beneath the plastic bag and toddler shirt, they found a folded emergency blanket, partially unrolled. Next to it, 2 crumpled food wrappers, granola bars long expired, and a disposable diaper, stiff and brittle with age. It was the kind sold in bulk stores, off-brand, size 3. The adhesive tabs had degraded. Forensic techs collected it all. The lab confirmed what the detectives already suspected. The DNA from the shirt and pacifier matched the original samples taken from Melissa's apartment in 2016. The diaper, though too degraded for a full profile, contained partial traces consistent with Liam. This was no false lead. It was real. And it told a terrifying story. Someone, possibly Melissa, possibly both of them, had spent time inside that space, hiding, living, or waiting. The nesting behavior suggested they hadn't been placed there, post-mortem. The wrappers weren't evidence of disposal, they were evidence of survival. The blanket hadn't been used as a cover, it had been folded to act as padding. Someone had tried to create comfort in a place designed for tools, not people. Investigators reconstructed the setup in a forensic lab. The layout indicated intentional use, not panic, routine, which meant it hadn't been spontaneous. They brought in structural experts. An aging contractor named Bill Ferris was tracked down. He'd worked on the motel in early 2017, shortly before the utility closet had been sealed. His memory was foggy, but he remembered the space. Back then, it had been part of a broader maintenance corridor that allowed access to plumbing and ductwork on the first floor. It had been used mainly for storage and occasional pest control, but during budget cuts, the motel owner decided to reduce maintenance access and seal off non-essential spaces. Bill and his team had drywalled the crawlspace, added insulation, and stacked old furniture in front of it. No one told them to check inside first. The realization settled like a weight. If someone had been inside when it was sealed, no one would have known. The work order hadn't required inspection. There were no permits or formal oversight, just 2 workers on an afternoon shift closing off a forgotten corner of a declining motel. That possibility rattled the team. Investigators rechecked the 2016 case file. They had searched room 16. They had opened closets. They had knocked on drywall, but never cut into it. Because back then, the crawlspace hadn't been visible. The cabinet had been in place. The room had looked standard. The layout hadn't raised alarms. And Melissa's case, as baffling as it was, hadn't yet pointed toward captivity. But now, that same square footage suggested something much darker: concealment. The question was whether Melissa had put herself there, or been put there. Criminal profilers weighed in. If Melissa had discovered the crawlspace herself, hiding with Liam, she would have needed time to gather supplies, time to remain silent, time to be alone without detection. But there were inconsistencies. No baby formula was ever found in her room, no extra food. She hadn't made purchases consistent with long-term planning. She'd been traveling light, 1 small duffel, no stroller, just diapers, bottles, a few changes of clothes. Not enough to survive in hiding, which shifted the theory. Someone else had prepared that space, and whoever it was had returned to it more than once. The motel's keycard system had been basic in 2016, no wireless logs, no timestamps. But a manual override key, used by staff, would have worked across multiple rooms. Former employees were re-interviewed, maintenance logs re-reviewed, but the paper trail was thin. Staff turnover had been high. Most names were long gone, relocated, some dead. No direct connection emerged, just a pattern. Multiple people had access, but one person had motive, opportunity, and silence on their side. The physical evidence was clear. Someone had hidden Liam, and possibly Melissa, inside a wall. It was temporary, functional, quiet. And then it was sealed. But sealed by who? And why did no one hear anything? Not crying, not footsteps, not movement. For all those days, the motel stayed open. People sleeping in nearby rooms, unaware that behind one cabinet, behind one drywall panel, was a space just large enough for a mother and child to wait for something that never came. The name wasn't in the original suspect pool. Alan Borsky appeared on old maintenance rosters, filed away in a locked cabinet that had never been digitized, shift logs from 2016, dusty and incomplete. But he was there. Night shift, part-time maintenance contractor, no HR file, no background check on record. Hired under a subcontractor the motel had used briefly that year and then quietly dropped. He had been working the week Melissa vanished. His time cards showed a shift ending at 11 p.m. the night of her disappearance. A closer look revealed he was clocked in again the following morning, early around 6:15 a.m., with no record of anyone calling him in. When asked, no one could explain the gap. Detectives tracked down former employees. Most barely remembered him. A few said he kept to himself. He was quiet, didn't talk much, and sometimes stayed late. One remembered he always had keys, too many, even for maintenance. They dangled from his belt in a thick loop, jingling as he moved down the halls. Another remembered him propping open storage closets, wandering between service corridors during slow hours. One housekeeper recalled a strange moment. She walked in on him sitting on the floor in one of the empty utility rooms, lights off. She asked if everything was okay. He told her he was checking for leaks. She didn't question it. That room was later sealed off. Alan Borsky quit the job just 4 weeks after Melissa's case went cold. His resignation note was brief, unsigned, left in a manila envelope on the front desk. He never collected his final check. The manager at the time made one call to follow up, then let it go. It was the kind of job people disappeared from without notice. No one thought it strange at the time. Now, in 2024, his name set off alarms. Borsky had died in 2021 of a heart attack in a subsidized housing unit in Caldwell. No next of kin, no funeral. His belongings had been placed in a county-owned storage unit and held under default. When police accessed the unit, they found what was left of his life in 4 plastic tubs. 2 were filled with tools, frayed extension cords, paint rollers. The third contained motel-issued towels, 3 room key cards, 2 labeled with masking tape, room 10 and room 16, and a crumpled maintenance polo. But the 4th bin was what froze everyone in place. Inside was a spiral-bound sketchbook. Rough drawings filled the pages, faces, hallways, vents, outlines of buildings. Pages toward the back became more specific. One depicted a woman and a baby standing in front of a vending machine. Another showed the rear hallway of a building with arrows pointing toward a panel labeled soft wall. In several drawings, a small child was curled inside a narrow box with the words "Quiet Baby" scrawled above it. On another page, "Tunnel Time" written over and over. Melissa's face wasn't photorealistic, but it was close enough to recognize. The shape of her jaw, her parted hair. Liam's form tucked under her arm. There was no mistaking who Borsky had been watching. Police recovered additional materials, an unlabeled flash drive that was too degraded to open, and a printed motel floor plan marked with notes, late deliveries, low noise, vent crawl okay. It became clear Borsky had mapped out more than just repairs. He had studied movement, watched habits, timed shifts. A background search revealed he'd spent time in juvenile detention in the late 90s. Records were sealed, but court summaries hinted at past allegations involving confinement and inappropriate surveillance. Nothing had followed him into adulthood. He had no arrests, no complaints during his time at the motel. Just faded into the background like maintenance workers often do. Present, invisible, trusted. What disturbed investigators most wasn't just the access he had. It was the mindset revealed in the sketches. He had turned the motel into a maze, a place of control. He hadn't written names. He had written patterns, the vent measurements, the duct capacity, the number of seconds it took for a camera to reset. The drawing of room 16 showed an X, where the crawl space had been discovered. Another mark sat in the wall adjacent to room 18, still unexplored. They checked it immediately. That wall was sealed shut, no visible entrance, no recent modifications. But behind it was another boxed-in gap, smaller, empty, a dead space built into the structure never accessed. The theory solidified. Borsky had created temporary pockets, rooms within rooms, just large enough to hold someone for hours, maybe days. Spaces no one would think to search because they didn't exist on any blueprint. Melissa and Liam had been hidden, not removed from the building, not taken far, but folded into the architecture itself. And now the question turned from who did it to when, and whether Melissa ever made it out of the walls Borsky built. The theory that had once seemed too far-fetched, too cruel to be real, was now the only one that made sense. Melissa hadn't vanished into the night. She hadn't run, hadn't been taken away in some vehicle that never appeared on any camera. She had been hidden inside the building, locked in a space no one thought to search. The evidence from the crawl space, Liam's shirt, the pacifier, the food wrappers, the soiled diaper, all suggested they had been alive, at least temporarily, in that confined space. But how long? And why hadn't anyone heard them? It took acoustic engineers 3 hours to answer that. They reconstructed the wall between the closet and room 16 using the original motel materials. Foam-backed drywall, old fiberglass insulation, a second panel layered from the renovation. When sound tests were conducted, crying, banging, screaming, the results were definitive. Beyond a faint murmur, nothing carried through. At most, a low rhythmic thump could be felt if someone was standing right next to the closet, but no voice, no baby wail, no panic, just silence. From inside, it was a box. From outside, it was a wall. The implication was devastating. Melissa could have screamed every hour of the day, and not a soul would have known. Then, a woman named Tessa Gorman came forward. She had stayed at the motel in room 18 the week Melissa disappeared. She'd been visiting her sister in the hospital and only remembered the case when news broke about the crawl space. She told investigators something strange had happened on her second night there. Around 11 p.m., she had heard a baby crying, not loud, just faint, rhythmic, like it was coming from somewhere behind the wall. She thought it was a neighboring room. She remembered pressing her ear to the wall but hearing nothing else. She dismissed it. She didn't report it. She checked out 2 days later. That statement reframed everything. The crawl space wasn't just a place Melissa had been held. It was where she had lived for at least part of those missing 72 hours. From the night of her disappearance to the time her phone stopped pinging and the investigation began, there had been a window. 3 days unaccounted for. In those 3 days, no one had searched that closet. No one had opened the wall. No one had listened. Detectives re-reviewed footage, shift records, weather logs. They pinpointed Melissa's last known movement at 10:15 p.m. on October 12th. The first officer stepped into room 16 at 2:04 p.m. on October 13th. That's roughly 16 hours. The remodel of the closet wasn't ordered until 5 months later. The space remained physically intact for weeks, which meant Melissa and Liam could have been inside that crawl space for days after the search began, hidden within reach, yet completely out of view. One theory gained traction. Alan Borsky had lured Melissa away from the vending machines, either by posing as motel staff, faking an emergency, or catching her off guard. He had worked maintenance for months. Guests recognized his uniform. His face wasn't suspicious. He had keys, he had time, and he had already mapped the place. Inside the crawl space, Melissa would have had no concept of time, no ability to cry out. The only light would have been what seeped in through hairline cracks or when the cabinet door was briefly shifted. No airflow, no ventilation, no schedule. For a mother with an infant, it would have been agony, containing a baby's cries, keeping them calm, keeping them fed. The food wrappers suggested some effort. Maybe Borsky gave them supplies. Maybe he came and went in short bursts. But if that's true, the question becomes, why didn't he keep bringing them food? Why didn't she make it out? One theory points to failure. Not murder, not malice, but collapse. Maybe Liam got sick. Maybe Melissa couldn't calm him. Maybe Alan panicked. Maybe the crying grew too loud and he feared someone would hear. Or maybe, and this haunted investigators more than anything else, maybe he had no intention of letting them leave at all. The crawl space was small, but the psychological picture it painted was massive. Control, secrecy, isolation. A soundproof prison built inside a building meant to welcome strangers. A woman and her baby, trapped in a motel while police interviewed guests a few feet away, while housekeeping changed sheets, while her car sat in the lot. She had been there. She had been alive. And then, at some point during that 72-hour void, she wasn't. The final thread came from a property deed buried in county archives. It was a parcel of land, 6 acres, rural, overgrown, tucked between 2 ridgelines 20 miles outside Ontario, Oregon. Alan Borsky had purchased it in 2013 for under $9,000. It had no structures on file, no utilities registered, and no listed occupants. When the investigators found the parcel tied to his name, they weren't sure what they were hoping for. Maybe a clue, maybe nothing. But when they arrived with ground-penetrating radar and a full search team in early summer 2024, something showed up. Near the back of the property, just beyond a rusted-out fence line and half-collapsed shed, the radar pinged. 2 disturbances in the earth, shallow, aligned. They weren't mechanical, they weren't animals, they were deliberate. Forensics marked the coordinates and began excavation. 2 hours in, the first blanket appeared, matted fabric, sun-bleached, still wrapped tightly around what turned out to be a woman's form curled on her side. 20 inches away, the second blanket. Smaller. The shape inside is unmistakable. They were wrapped together in motel bedding. The tag still read, Sleepy Pine Motel 2014. Beneath the folds, both bodies were in fetal position, preserved unnaturally by the dry soil and sealed wrappings. There were no obvious wounds, no signs of trauma. It was as if they had laid down and never moved again. What struck investigators most was the presence of something else between them. A small, green, portable propane heater, partially collapsed, valve still closed, tank rusted, but intact. It was surrounded by blackened earth and a metal bowl filled with ash. The heater had vent holes along the side, ones that when used indoors or in tight quarters could leak deadly levels of carbon monoxide. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had already implied. Melissa and Liam had both died from carbon monoxide poisoning. There was no struggle, no restraint marks, no signs of force, just hypoxia, silent, internal suffocation. Melissa's lungs showed higher levels, suggesting she'd lived longer than her son. Her arms had been found curled around him. She had likely tried to shield him, unaware they were both slipping away. The cause of death was ruled accidental, but the circumstances surrounding it weren't. Investigators pieced together a chilling, almost surgical timeline. At some point during the 72 hours following her disappearance, Borsky had realized the motel was no longer safe. There had been too much attention. The police were knocking on doors. The motel owner was reviewing footage. He had likely promised Melissa an escape, possibly even made her believe they were going somewhere safe. The sketches in his notebook had mapped a route west. One entry simply read, "Move before next check-in." Melissa, exhausted, isolated, with no phone and no way out, may have seen it as her only option. Maybe she believed he was trying to help. Maybe she didn't. Either way, she got into a vehicle with him, likely under the cover of night. She was transported nearly 90 minutes to that patch of overgrown property, where a temporary shelter had been assembled, an old camping tent, tarp fragments, and the heater. It was cold that week. Temperatures had dropped into the 30s overnight. If Melissa had been promised warmth, she may have accepted it. The heater, likely meant to keep them alive, became the thing that killed them. There was no sign she tried to run. No evidence of struggle at the scene, just 2 blankets wrapped with care. Liam's was secured with electrical tape, as if Borsky had wanted it to stay sealed. Melissa's was knotted by hand. After the deaths, it's believed Borsky panicked, not in rage, not in violence, but in something colder. Finality. He returned to the motel within days. He cleaned the crawl space, removed any visible trace, leaned the cabinet back into place, and signed his resignation slip. He never spoke to anyone about that weekend. He never returned to the property. The bodies remained undisturbed for nearly 8 years. Detectives sat with the timeline for days before speaking publicly. When the story broke, the headline was simple: Remains of missing Idaho mother and infant found on remote property. Dana Crane was notified first. She didn't ask for details. She only asked if Liam had been in her daughter's arms. The coroner confirmed he had. There would be no trial, no justice through the courts. Borsky had died 3 years before of a massive cardiac event in his apartment, alone. No family, no funeral, no confession. Just sketches, a heater, and a pair of key cards that told the story he never did. But now, after so many years of silence, the mystery that haunted the motel, that tore through Melissa's family and baffled investigators across 2 states, had been laid bare. It hadn't been a perfect crime. It had been a careful mistake, one driven by obsession, control, and a need to keep Melissa near, out of sight, unheard. But it failed. Because the motel changed hands, because one janitor opened a sealed door, because one drawing told the truth, and because one shallow grave never sank deep enough to bury everything. The service was held on a gray October morning, almost 8 years to the day since Melissa Crane and her son Liam had vanished. The church was modest, seated on the edge of Boise, the same one Melissa had attended as a child. The pews were filled, not just with family, but with investigators who had stayed on the case long after the spotlight faded, search volunteers who had walked miles through mud and brush, and motel staff who had worked the front desk, cleaned the rooms, passed her in the halls without knowing what would happen that night in 2016. The caskets were small, side by side. Melissa's covered in pale yellow lilies, Liam's in white cotton roses. Dana Crane spoke once during the service, standing stiffly at the podium, her voice steady. She said her daughter had been brave, that Liam had been loved, and that some people don't run, they wait, even when no one's coming. In the weeks after the remains were identified and the timeline confirmed, the Redwood Inn, formerly Sleepy Pine Motel, shut down. The owner, who had only purchased it 2 years prior, cited spiritual unease and a flurry of canceled bookings. Within months, the building was slated for demolition. City officials, who had ignored public pressure for years, finally allowed it to be torn down under a safety pretext. The demolition crew arrived at dawn on a Sunday, and by evening, the walls that had hidden so much were nothing but fractured beams and loose tile. The crawl space, now excavated and documented, was one of the first things to go. But before it was flattened, a local advocacy group for missing persons placed a small plaque into the floorboards. Simple steel, black text, no photo. It read, "They were always here. We just didn't hear them." That line, borrowed from Dana's interview weeks earlier, became the final sentence in most news articles. It spread across forums, Reddit threads, and true crime pages. People called it haunting. But for those closest to the case, it wasn't poetic. It was literal. The room had been checked. Dozens of people had stood in it. I walked past the wall, knocked gently, listened briefly, assumed absence. But behind insulation and drywall, a mother and baby had spent their last days, unseen, unheard, just on the other side of silence. Anthony Marks, the janitor who had opened the sealed closet in 2024, spoke once. A local reporter asked what made him pry open the door. He hadn't been instructed to. The room had been marked as off-limits for years. Anthony shrugged and said he just had a feeling, that when he walked past it, something always felt off. He said he never believed in ghosts or premonitions, but he knew when buildings were trying to forget something. He said it felt like that wall was holding its breath. He didn't speak again publicly. In the final report released by the Oregon State Police, Melissa's case was classified as abduction, and unlawful confinement leading to accidental death. No charges were filed posthumously. No criminal trial. No one to interrogate, no one to confront. The documents included the timeline, forensic evidence, and behavioral analysis, but none of it explained what people wanted to know most. Why her? Why Liam? What had Alan Borsky seen that made him choose them? The truth is, he hadn't written it down. He had mapped blueprints, timed camera blind spots, cataloged noises. But the reason, the real one, was never found. It may not have existed in a way that could be understood. Dana didn't need it. She told detectives that knowing what happened was enough, that Liam hadn't been thrown in a ditch or lost to the woods. That Melissa hadn't given up. She had stayed close. She had survived long enough to try. That mattered more than motive. In time, the motel lot was flattened, grass seeded over it. The town, like so many places marked by a story they never asked for, tried to move on. But Room 16 stayed in the background, an internet legend, a topic on late-night podcasts, a landmark people drove past slower than usual. Tourists would sometimes stop, unaware of the full story, just to look, but locals mostly left it alone. They remembered when the lights had been on, when Melissa had checked in, tired but hopeful, carrying her son and asking if the room had a microwave. A regional crime conference added her case to a training module. The title, Missed Spaces, Structural Blindness in Abduction Cases. Her story became a teaching point for law enforcement, for search teams, for future janitors, contractors, and motel staff. The lesson was simple. Not everything missing has moved. Sometimes it's just hidden better than most know how to see. And for those who had waited, for Dana, for the cousin who ran the GoFundMe, for the detective who kept her file on his desk even after retirement, it didn't bring peace, but it brought finality. Melissa and Liam were returned, not because the system worked, but because someone refused to ignore a locked door. 8 years, one wall, one janitor, and the truth that had waited in silence just inches away from where the search began.